So, thanks for the introduction, and let me start by showing you two pictures. So, first of all, we have the 10-year network development plan that has been introduced by the third package, which basically was a kind of, at least initially, a bottom-up exercise, collecting all the investments that you can find in national investment plans and then looking at European level if there is a consistency inside and trying to go to a more top-down approach. Then we also have something called projects of common interest, and we have a first list that was published in November last year. And what the idea of this list is that it is less projects, so for electricity about 100 and also for gas. And they have been carefully selected because the idea is that these projects are very important for the EU strategy. So then let's have a look at the next slide. So here we see an opinion of ACER from just before the summer holidays, so 30 July. And it includes a first progress monitoring, because more and more we will see that ACER has a role to monitor progress of these investments. And this pie chart is for these investments we find in the 10-year network development plan. And as we can see here, there is already about 1/3 of projects that is experiencing some delay. So then that brings me immediately to my first poll, and I would like you to tell me what you think are the main, what is the main reason for this delay. Is it more permitting related problems, or has it something to do with the investment incentives of TSOs? Because most of these projects are TSO projects. So I look forward to see what you think about that. Let me launch the poll and let me give you some time to reply. So response A, you think that the main reason is permitting. Response B, you think it has something to do with TSO incentives. I see that voting is very quickly this morning, so I'll give you just a bit more time. Okay. Great, so we have most of you. Let me share the results with you. So, as you can see, we have 58 of you that think 58%, and we are around more than 100 participants, so that's a very nice result. That think that it has to do with permitting, and around 40 think it is more to do with incentives. So let me show you the next slide then. So if we look at the opinion of ACER, these were the reasons put forward in that opinion based on, I guess, a survey with the project developers. And as you can see, you have a blue part here, 25% is saying permit granting. So that is response A. And in a way, you could also argue that even these two categories here, national law changes and environmental problems, are somewhat indirectly or directly related to permitting, because, for instance, law changes, if I looked into the document, is often related to permitting law. So you could say that from this graph, you could get the impression that is mainly response A that is true. But let me also share with you this illustration. So here, I took one graph from a report by our colleagues at Florence School of Regulation, and actually Vincent already did a webinar on that in June. So if you want to know more about that study, have a look at Vincent. But here it's relevant just to indicate that at least there is this one study that tried to do a benchmarking of TSO incentives. And what they did, they looked at these 5 countries here, and they mapped on the x-axis the rate of return of the TSO in those countries for doing investment. And here you see TSO risk. And at least from this mapping and from their first analysis of these frameworks, they did see significant differences. You would of course expect that that the rate of return is in line with the risk, but as you can see in this graph, in some countries have the same risk and a different rate of return. So you could expect that TSO incentives is also one of the issues. So I mean, clearly there is an argument for both responses. But then let me bring you closer to the topic of this webinar. So this webinar is actually about one article in this new 10E regulation. The 10E regulation is the one that introduced these projects of common interest and includes several procedures and new deadlines related to trying to speed up projects of common interest. And then you have Article 13 that talks about TSO investment incentives. And I took an abstract from that article just to tell you what it is about. So what it says is maybe there are project promoters that incur higher risk for constructing, operating or maintenance of a project of common interest. And then the idea is that national regulatory authorities recognize this risk and ensure that there are appropriate incentives granted. It also says that national regulatory authorities shall publish how they will do that. And this has meanwhile been done, and this has been summarized in this recommendation here from ACER from June 2014. Also important is to tell you that there is the 7th paragraph of this article that says that the Commission, so the European Commission, may issue guidelines. So in principle it implies that the EU might say how we should give incentives to investment in the national frameworks. So that's what this work we did recently is about, how the EU should or should not use this opportunity to make guidelines. But before I go further, let me illustrate two countries that already do something quite interesting. So first, Italy. So we are in 2004 when they introduced a new regulatory framework, and the context was that Italy at that time had just had a blackout, and the perception was that some strategically important investment was missing. So what was the solution in 2004? Solution was to say, okay, we have normal default investment, but we are going to make a new category of investment that we're going to call interconnection and congestion reducing domestic lines. And that category of projects, maybe implicitly because they have more risk, or they are more important, or they are, there is more urgency, combination of all these factors, and we are going to give stronger incentives to the TSO to invest in these projects. How? Well, first, the risk is reduced by increasing the regulatory period from 4 to 12 years, and a WACC premium of 2% was introduced to increase the return. Now, what has been the experience? Well, here you see in the illustration that lots of projects have gone through this process since 2004. And one statistic is that since 2008, 8 billion has been invested under this framework, and 28 projects are ongoing. That's Italy. Then another example where there is already a rich experience is from the US, where actually the context was quite similar. They also had a blackout in 2003. And also there, the perception was that there was a lack of strategically important investment. So their solution has been also to create a new category of projects which they call interstate investment, which is to improve reliability and reduce regional congestion, so a bit similar to Italy actually. And then the solution also has some similarities. They go towards a case-by-case assessment by the federal regulator FERC. And in this assessment, it is up to the project promoter to argue if and why they need stronger incentives. And incentives can be, just like in Italy, to reduce the risk, but also to increase the return. And just to give you one example, there is this project called Duquesne Light, which is number 3 on the illustration here. So it's in the Pittsburgh area, and this dark color here is PGM, so in the east coast of the US. And that project was a landmark decision for FERC, and it referred to this decision in several other cases, because they did grant some additional incentives to this project developer, but not everything they asked. So FERC was not fully convinced with the argumentation and did not give the full premium that the project was asking. I think it was something like 1.5% was requested and only 1 granted. So overall, also in the US, there is a lot of experience with this framework, and we found that more or less 85 cases have been dealt with, representing a total of 60 billion in potential investment. So now, what does that imply for Europe? So we know that European Commission has an opportunity to make guidelines. So I would like to know what you think. After you've seen these two illustrations, do you think that we should use these EU guidelines dealing with PCIs to sort of say, okay, all countries should go towards a case-by-case assessment and then also a case-by-case design of investment incentives, or we don't need guidelines on that because countries are doing this already their own way and it is fine the way we are doing it today in Europe. So no need for guidelines. Let me launch this second poll. So I'm launching the poll and I'm looking forward to what you think. Okay, that's a more surprising result for me. Very interesting. So most of you voted. Let me close the poll, share the results. So 90% are inspired by the two examples and think we should go to a case-by-case assessment of projects of common interest and then also a case-by-case decision on what type of investments we are going to give to the projects. Well, up to now, I have been discussing this in several meetings, and in the meetings it was more controversial than in this webinar, I have to say. So I am surprised to see that only 10% think that today everything is okay and we don't need guidelines. So let me tell you a little bit of the argumentation you could have in favor of response A or B, and how we also discuss it in our policy brief. So first, response A. So the argument for case by case is, and that is also in line with what Italy is doing, the US is doing, and also more recently the UK and France, but there is less experience with the new framework they have. And basically the argument for case by case is that if you do the current practice, which is giving the same return and the same risk for all investments, it implies in a way that you overpay for low-risk projects and underpay for high-risk projects. There is a typo in my slide. So it's overpay low-risk and underpay for high-risk. Of course, you could increase the return, and then you could even bring it up to the level that it's enough to finance a high-risk project, but then you are overpaying really a lot for the low-risk project. So you always have this trade-off if you have one return for all investments. And it also implies that whatever return you choose, if I was a TSO and I have a portfolio of investment, of course, if I can sort of choose the ones I do first, I would do the ones first that have a lower risk because I'm getting the same return anyway. And this is a well-known issue from finance. This happens in any other sector. So, okay, what is then a possible argumentation to say, no, it's not a good idea to force everybody to do case by case? Well, there are two strong arguments. So one argument is to say the benefit of case by case will be limited for some countries or for all countries because it really depends on how heterogeneous these projects of common interest are in terms of risk. If they are more or less of the same category, maybe it's not necessary to have this very sophisticated case by case. And this could be true for some countries because they only have one or two PCIs, and while other countries have many and they could be very heterogeneous. So it's not obvious to force all countries to do the same approach from a benefit point of view. Also for a cost point of view, it could be quite different from country to country because, of course, as we know, not every country regulator has the same resources and skills. So while this case-by-case approach does require some new skills and resources, let's take the example of the FERC. They basically created a whole new department that is dealing with these case-by-case assessments. And they build up the skills over the years. And again, also for companies, it requires to have a new type of relation and discussion with the regulator. So not obvious if we should really enforce this in all countries. That's why our recommendations in the policy brief for EU guidelines are more prudent. What we say is what is the real issue is that we need adequate frameworks. whatever they are, case by case or not case by case. Because if they are not adequate, then some investments that are important for Europe, but incentivized in one country, could not be forthcoming, and that's an EU issue. So reasons for EU to do something, and this could be to benchmark national investment frameworks. Benchmark, what we mean is to do the kind of mapping that I showed my colleagues tried to do for a first time, and to do it annually, and this could at least have some sunshine regulation and a discussion on what is adequate and what might not be so adequate. Then something else could be done through guidelines, and this could also be a role for ACER, which is of course always to spread good practices. And we saw at least already one interesting practice on coordination, where we have a case, NEMO, an interconnector between UK and Belgium, and where both regulators got together and said, okay, it is joint project by our two TSOs, so let's give them the same incentives. Otherwise, you have half of the project having a certain incentive scheme and another half having another incentive scheme, while in the end it is one project. So that's a very interesting practice. And then, of course, there are already some countries in Europe, like I referred to Italy, I also referred to France and UK, that have a case-by-case approach. So what could be the role of EU guidelines there? Well, ACER could be given the competence to maybe assist NRAs if they want to. I'm not saying the UK, France or Italy want assistance of ACER, but maybe some other country, some of the regulators that have voted in this way could be saying, okay, we don't want to create a whole new department. It would be nice that we have some assistance by ACER, and then ACER can have economies of scale and create a department there that becomes very skilled at doing this assessment. So it could be a voluntary thing offered at European level. Same could be true for TSOs that don't want to do it themselves. They could have some assistance by ENTSO-E. Okay, so this was more or less the policy brief. I also wanted to have one more slide before we enter into Q&A, just to show that this is a brief that is part of a series. So if you want to know more, you can have a look at our previous work, where we worked also on the cost-benefit analysis. So this is what is done to do a selection of PCIs, and the topic of cross-border cost allocation, which is about how to share the costs, the investment costs of projects of common interest between member states. And we also did 2 webinars on that, so these policy briefs you can find on the YouTube page of Florence School of Regulation in the form of a webinar. Also for your information, the team at Florence School that is working on these topics is Nico and myself, and you see us here. And we will also continue to work on the whole regulation of projects of common interest. In fact, today we are looking again at CBA and CBCA for power and gas, because when we worked on it, it was before all these projects of common interest were active. So now they are, and we can have a look at what is the experience with the first CBCA decisions and where we are with the CBA methodology. This is ongoing. What we also are going to do is, all of this work is how to best implement the regulation which is given. But of course, we could also discuss if the regulation itself could maybe have some improvements, and that's the work we will start to do towards the end of the year and the beginning of next year. And that just leaves me to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, Leo, we thank you for your presentation and for the background information and contextualization of your research. So we can start with the Q&A now, as we received a lot of questions, and we can also see you now. Perfect. So I will start with this first question.
Yes.
Do you think projects have heterogeneous risk profiles?
Well, the things we had in mind, why projects could have heterogeneous profiles, is both related to the stage of development, so before construction, and during construction. So we know that in Europe, for instance, we have projects onshore, offshore, Some projects are using innovative technology. Some of it is very standardized, typically onshore, but not always. And offshore is using new technology, is doing... so I do see good reasons why there could be promoters arguing that there are differences in risk. Also, typically, you could say that the difference between national and cross-border is that there is more authorities involved. So the development process is more risky, you could say, because more authorities, more coordination between authorities. There are definitely good arguments to say why there could be heterogeneity in the risk profile.
Okay, the next question is about one of the approach you were suggesting. So, is case-by-case assessment not introducing additional regulatory uncertainty into the system?
Yeah, it's something new. So it could introduce additional risk. But what I think is important is to discuss how it can be implemented in a way that it avoids as much as possible to introduce additional risk. And what I think is nice about the US approach is that it has not been done at state level, but at a higher level, where you have a regulator that is dealing with many cases. Remember, I said 85, I think. So 85 cases, then you know after a while how the regulation is being implemented. So also, if we looked a bit at some of these cases, and you see that the FERC in the beginning had to still interpret the regulation, how to do the assessment, but after a while they started referring to previous cases. At some point the regulation has even been clarified. So it's a process, and in the end it can be a low risk. You as a promoter, we also see that promoters after a while are not asking everything anymore. They already know what they can get, what they cannot get. So I got the impression from the US that it can be a quite stable, predictable process. But of course, I'm sure there is also litigation in the US, as always. There is litigation with some projects and controversy. So probably also depends on who you talk to.
Yeah. Just one question that can be attached to this one. Do this case-by-case assessment take into account interaction among the different projects?
This depends. So in the US, I've seen that what is called a project in many cases is including something, really a cluster of lots of investments that have been part of a regional plan. So more a type of 10-year network development plan, but the top-down one, really fully top-down. So there you could think that this has already been taken into account. If in Europe we would do it for a project of common interest, as we discussed in some of our previous work, the way we define projects of common interest, I'm not always sure whether complementary projects are already taken account of in the best way. So it really depends on the context, no? Then in the Italian context it will be again different. So it depends on the eligibility criteria, what is the type of analysis that has already been done on the project before it can apply to this framework. So there is not a one answer.
Then a question about risky projects. So is a high-risk project one in which we should not invest at all?
In some cases, yes, definitely. It allows me to maybe clarify a little bit some of the assumptions. I have only a bit of time in this webinar, but of course, what we say in the policy brief is we assume that at the selection process of the investments, this has already been scrutinized. So if we select projects of common interest in a good way, with a good method, a good cost-benefit analysis method, and I'm well aware that there is still some improvements to be done on that part of the story, but if we do that well, when we come to this stage, we should not worry anymore that we are giving too much money to a project that should not happen. So it should be a two-step process. We should have a very good selection, and then once we have done that, we should make sure that we give enough return to the project, because we are convinced that it has a very high value despite the risk, and then we want it to go forward.
Okay. We really received a lot of questions, so I'm trying to screen and to select among them some that can be really interesting for everybody. So, okay, can a project with a PCA status be rejected by national regulation authorities in national investment plans?
That's I don't know. I honestly don't know, because I am not a legal expert of the text. But it should not. So, I mean, what we say in our policy brief, which comes close to this question, and I didn't put it in my slides, but if you read the policy brief, the recommendations, can you see my slides now, or you only see the webinar? Okay, so I didn't include it as a bullet point, but in the policy brief we do say that if there are countries that have a special framework to speed up investment that are important for national policy objectives, because if we look at the history of these frameworks, both in Italy, the US, but also France and UK, of course it was done before we had the European regulation. So the focus there was on national policy objectives, and as a recommendation we say that the EU guidelines could also ensure that there is no discrimination against projects of common interest. So that projects of common interest that are important for European policy objectives at least receive at least as good a treatment as the ones that are important for national objectives. So this is a recommendation, and I'm not sure if it is already fully ensured by the text of the regulation. It could be part of the guidelines.
Okay, and then I would ask you a last question, which is a more general one, but just to give some background information maybe on the context. To what extent is the proposed approach to case-by-case analysis different to the existing framework?
Well, it depends on the country, but most countries have a very, very simple framework where a TSO has a portfolio of investment, and this portfolio has a rate of return that is negotiated every regulatory period, say every 4 or 5 years, and can be changed. But the regulator and the TSO do not enter into the discussion of will a different investment get a different return. There is just one return that is agreed upon or negotiated. So that's really the framework that applies to all investment, both nationally and projects of common interest in most countries, with some exceptions here and there, of course. And I highlighted some of the exceptions in the webinar that are a bit more in the policy brief, and everything, all the details you can find are in this opinion of ACER. So this one I had here on my slide, this document recommendation from ACER from 27 June is including a big annex with all special features of incentives of different countries. So you can have a look there.